Evolution.org Hardcore 2.0 is coming your way. This is episode 152. Today we're going to do a tough episode. It's going to be called Running a High Carb Diet on Steroid Cycles, Euro-Pharma. And look, at the end of the day, this is one of those topics that you don't hear much about. And if you do, it's very brief because it's not a topic that a lot of these guys, these gurus online and stuff are going to try to even attempt to talk about because they don't want to go under the hood. They don't want to really study this stuff. They don't want to use that brain power to really get into these tough topics. But this is very important to understand nutrition and whatever stances you have on carbs, whether you're pro high carbs, you're pro low carbs, whatever you are, this is still a very important podcast to kind of understand and gain some knowledge about how carbs and protein versus protein, and also how to incorporate carbs when you're running steroid cycles. Because some steroids, it's going to be different. So we're going to go over what is a carb and examples. We're talking about carbs in the human body, best cycles for high carbs, cycling carbs, and why Euro-Pharma is trusted. So let's first touch on, I just wanted to first remind everybody out there who's listening, is you can follow us and you can actually subscribe. If you go to evolution.org/podcast, come on in, subscribe. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify also. And we also are, you can come on the forum and listen to the podcast. But listen, like, sub, review, comment. We'd love to hear if there's something you want us to talk about. We'd love for you to let us know. And it helps our podcast keep going. It helps us with the algorithms, and it helps us continue bringing you these podcasts. So Mobster and I really, we want to keep these podcasts going for as long as possible and want our podcast to be successful. So it's up to you guys to keep that going. So please go on there. Like I said, evolution.org/podcast. You'll find links to Spotify and Apple. So let's first get into carb. Now, what is a carb? That's a very, very good question. And look, at the end of the day, a carb is a molecule that contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it's one of the three main ingredients of food, along with protein and fat. And in bodybuilding, we usually the cookie cutter layout when it comes to your macros and how much carbs you're supposed to get is 40%. You're supposed to get 40% carbs, 40% protein, 20% fat. Of course, if you come on the forum and you take a look at the logs, a lot of people who are tracking their macros, it's going to be a little different. Some people will go higher on the carbs, some people will go lower. Now, when it comes to examples of carbohydrates, there's many different examples. You've got glucose, you've got fructose, you got galactose, you have starches, you have cellulose, you have amylose. There's different types of starchy carbs. There's other types of carbs out there that are more fructose based, like fruit, obviously. And you have different types of carbs. You know, vegetables can be an example of a carb, or a cake can be an example of a carb. So there's many, many different examples of carbohydrates. Now, if you look at the updated information, the dietary guidelines that just came out in the early 2020s for Americans recommend that you get 45 to 65% of your daily calories that come from carbs. So it's much higher than the bodybuilding cookie cutter 40%. So we're going to talk a little bit about that on this podcast, guys, and try to explain that. And I think at the end of the day, I think a lot of that has to do with, bodybuilders being more disciplined with their diet and
Yep.
bodybuilders going more protein than typically do. So we're going to talk a little bit on the next segment more about carbs in the human body. But let me bring in Mobster first for his take on what is a carb and carb examples.
Yeah. I mean, look, ultimately, the way that sometimes look, you need fats, you need oils in your body to lubricate your joints. You need a small percentage of fat, for example, Steve, for things like your eyeballs and the flexibility of your skin and so on and so forth. So, in simple terms, very, very simple terms, protein is essential. And of course, all of the macros, protein, especially protein and fat, arguably, Steve, are for keeping us ticking over in terms of making sure that the machine works. i.e. the human body. But carbohydrates are what's providing the energy. Now, in reality, of course, stored body fat can be used for energy. Protein, under certain circumstances, which would be incredibly restricted, can be used for energy, but it's very difficult. So it's on a day-to-day basis, for us to be able to function and do the things that we do, carbohydrates are providing the energy. They are the gas that goes into the car. The makeup of the car, the build of the car, the structure of the car, and when I say car, I'm of course referring to the human body, is protein, and the lubricants, to stop the car seizing up, to allow the wheels to rotate, to be greased and oiled and whatever else, comes from fat. And that's a very simple sort of way of assuming these things. Now, for some reason or other, possibly because we're more muscular, as we should be, or stronger, because we should be, or leaner, because we should be, as athletes, as bodybuilders, as people that go to the gym, the macros, as they're well known, become almost mythologically discussed. And you get into the whole percentage thing, it's incredibly complicated. These are arguably, Steve, as you'd understand, of course, and I would hope some of the listeners, guidelines. There will be differences. And look, it's not just the obvious physical differences. I'm taller and I weigh more than Steve. Steve is leaner than I am and has different aims when he goes to the gym. That applies to you listeners too. But there's also differences in our lifestyles. And I would imagine that there's a good percentage of our listeners, Steve, as we've discussed recently, that are blue collar, which means they're working. And I don't just mean sitting in their office, as Steve does, arguably dealing with numbers, dealing with finances, but literally people that are sweeping up, cutting wood, cutting steel, welding steel, physically loading shelves in shops, walking around all day doing the things that they need to do. And the idea that we can all have some, as Steve referenced earlier on, the all too popular, quote unquote, cookie cutter approach gets thrown out. And then, yes, without getting into what foods people can eat, whether they're allergic to certain things, whether there's genetic predispositions, for example, twin races and where you live in the world, and all that kind of stuff. And we will also touch on slightly in the next segment. We're also going to talk about the quality of food. I've touched on other shows when we've talked about these things with the differences in nutrition, just the availability of nutrients in foods now and the choices that people are making when it comes to foods versus, for example, 50 years ago, Steve. And that's without getting into the lifestyles that a great many Americans and British, that are the biggest listeners to this show, make when it comes to choices in the supermarket. And this applies to bodybuilders. The obvious thing, just to finish on this particular thought process, Steve, is, as we reiterated again and again and again on these shows, and especially on the forum, the healthier you eat, the more controlled your food is, the more meal prepping you do, and that includes obviously carbohydrate sources, the better the outcome. That's really, really difficult to argue. We've done 2 or 3 shows specifically, I believe, on the if it fits your macros approach. And the idea, as Steve quite correctly said earlier on, that you could have a cake, which is a form of carbohydrate, and compare that, for example, say to red rice, Steve, or something similar, or fibrous carbs, say, for example, from broccoli or carrots or an aubergine or a potato, and compare that to a cake, it's just almost facile. You almost laugh. Right? So the quality, the way things are prepared, the doing it yourself versus buying it from the supermarket, and all those kind of things. Look, ultimately, and I use this example in other shows, if the top genetics, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, have to have good carbs, clean carbs, and manipulate the carb variables in their diet in order to look amazing, and you do not possess the same level of genetics, etc., then it is a good idea for you to listen to this show and any follow-up show that we do on these kind of concepts and thought processes, so that you can benefit from learning that even with God-given genetics, you need to eat a certain particular way. And that includes the importance of running a high carb diet when you're on steroids, for example. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, and let's go over some bodybuilder carb options that bodybuilders like to eat. And as Mobster mentioned, potatoes are a big one. There's so many different potatoes. I just got potatoes yesterday. I got 2 pounds from the grocery store. Organic potatoes. They were the
Yeah.
red potatoes, and I'll get
Yep.
the sweet. There's like 5, 6 different types of sweet potatoes at my
Yes.
health food store. There's so many different types of potatoes. And they're not expensive. You can buy potatoes for less than $2 a pound, $1.50 a pound. So I got those. I cut them up and I put them in my air fryer for at about 300 or 390 degrees, 380 or 390 degrees for about 45 to 50 minutes, and I let them spin. I have one of those rotisserie air fryers, and I let them spin in there for 45 minutes. Boom, done. And those are some healthy carb examples. Another one, oatmeal. We see a lot of bodybuilders throughout getting oatmeal. This has been a very popular one since I can remember, Mom. So I don't know when that started, but oatmeal is a pretty easy to digest option for a lot of you out there that you can, if you want some carbs, on your cycle or before the gym, just some raw oatmeal. Now, you be careful with oatmeal. As Mobster said, food quality is important. So when it comes to oatmeal, the oatmeal that you're getting that comes in those packages is very sugary in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And they
Let,
have,
let me let me jump in
yeah,
while
go ahead.
Steve clears his throat. Right. So let me give you an example, listeners. It's just a bad example versus a good example. The cheapest oatmeal you can buy, which ironically I have here, Steve, which you might also call porridge, literally has just oatmeal in it. There's a little bit of a discussion about whether these are cut a certain particular way in order to prepare the product. But you've also seen, and my local Lidl's has got this, so it's a nationwide thing for supermarkets, and you'll have this in the States as well. Those little sachets of oatmeal, but as often as not, these are the ones that have got food flavoring added to them. So, for example, we have, again, this is Lidl's, the little high protein ones that I can't stand the taste. I've literally bought one, Steve, never buying it again. And it will have some sort of sweetener in there. It'll have color in there. It'll have the flavoring in there. And you go, if a person didn't know any better, Stephen Mobster said we should buy oatmeal. This is high protein oatmeal. I'm buying this. I've got to be honest, Steve. I'd be crude. It's shit. I would rather buy my own unflavored 1 kilo bag like I do now. They do like a paper bag and add stuff to it myself, like fruit, like honey, like cinnamon, rather than buy that other stuff. If it's got more than oatmeal in it, you need to be able to read the ingredients. So there is definitely a difference in quality there. Absolutely. The other one that Steve hasn't mentioned yet, and I'll bring him back in for this, of course, and you talked about rice cookers here, Steve, would be rice. So what would your choice on that be? And of course, I suspect you've already got a rice cooker.
Yeah, and another great point on that, Mobster, rice is very crucial. If you buy rice in packages, you'll notice if you take a look at it, they add these refined oils to them and they add preservatives because they want it. And people want to buy those packages, throw them in the microwave for a minute and a half, and boom, now they have rice. Well, that rice is not going to be a good option. And a lot of times, these rice fields are sprayed with pesticides and other harmful chemicals as well. So you want to make sure you get organic pesticides. It's almost funny, Mobster, that we're doing this podcast and we're bringing this up because a week ago I was upstairs, right, and my spouse she starts screaming from downstairs, and I'm like, oh my god, what's going on? Is the house on fire? I run downstairs, and she's like, there's bugs in the rice. There's bugs in the rice. She's like, there's ants in the rice. No, she says there's ants in the rice, and I look at it, and I see these little black bugs moving around. They weren't ants. They were those bugs that actually lay eggs inside of rice grains. And then they
Oh, lovely.
hatch when the rice sits there for a long period of time and you don't use the rice in time, they'll actually hatch and then they'll kind of reproduce within the rice. So they were crawling within the rice, even though
That's more protein.
yeah, it's more, even though, and she's like, get this away from me. She was like flipping
Yeah, I
out.
can understand, man. I'll freak out.
So
There's those even silly things like Steve. They add waxes
yeah,
so it
but
looks nice on the
let me
bag.
finish. Yeah, let me finish because it's
Yeah,
important. But I told her I was like, that's a good sign that there's bugs because that means that that rice is actually organic. It says organic on the package, but that means that it's actually organic. It's just like when you buy lettuce from the supermarket. Are there bugs on the lettuce are there no bugs? Now, obviously, a lot of times they wash off the bugs, but if I see like dead bugs or bugs on the lettuce, because they put it in the refrigerator and the bugs die. But that's a good sign that there's bugs on the lettuce. That means it's actually organic, that the bugs are living. So it's not a bad thing. So it's ironic that we're doing that, but it's very important to get high quality carbs if you're going to go with carbs. So rice is a great option. Rice cooker is a great weapon. They're only like 20 or 25 bucks. You can buy a rice cooker. Fruit is another option. And I'm gonna get back to fruit in a second, but let me go over some others. Vegetables, very, very important. Did you know vegetables have ingredients that can help with cancer in the body? And there's not many things out there that you can say that indole 3 carbinol is a compound that actually helps fight cancer in the body. So if you're not getting your vegetables, you're not getting that. So it's a great option. Raw honey, great add-on to your oatmeal to give it some flavor versus getting sugar. Lentils, legumes. Just be careful with digestion. You might want to take in a digestive enzyme if you're going to go after those. Some dairy options are going to be healthy carbs, and then some healthy grains are going to be healthy carbs. Now on fruit, I'm going to rant a little bit on fruit, and then we're going to talk about some junky carb options. But look, fruit has been considered the enemy in bodybuilding for a long time, but this is a mistake, and I'm going to explain why. And fruit is great for digestion because if you eat a piece of pineapple or eat a piece of papaya, they contain an ingredient called bromelade. They also contain other compounds that help break down the foods that you just ate. So it's a great option to have a couple pieces of pineapple or a couple pieces of papaya after pretty much every meal, especially if you're eating a big protein meal, a big carb meal, and that will help you digest your food. But also they have things like fiber, which are going to be important, minerals, which are going to be important, vitamins, which are going to be important, and other compounds that help boost your immune system and help hydrate you. Some of these compounds we're going to talk about on this podcast from Euro-Pharmacy, some of these steroids, like Tren, for example,
yeah,
they make you feel hot all day. So, what is better than having a nice, refreshing piece of melon if you're
yeah,
on trend and getting that throughout the day? Because that's going to help hydrate you. That's going to give you all that water. Melon is 95% plus made of water. So, that's a lot of water going into your body, and that's good quality carbs if you're going to go with a high carb diet on some of these theories that we're going to talk about in a second. So, why are you scared of fruit? You shouldn't be scared of fruit. Fruit is something that we evolved. Although we were, yes, I understand we were polyolithic, we were eating a lot of meat at one point. We also evolved at one point to be able to see different colors. And part of that reason we see different colors is so we can locate fruit in the jungle to pick off a tree to eat. So we
yeah.
absolutely are supposed to be eating fruits and vegetables as human beings. They're very, very important part of our
Let
diet.
me address that just for a second, Steve. You and I have done quite a few shows where Steve and I refer to the history of humanity, and we say I think it's not really debatable that humanity is incredibly adaptive, incredibly flexible. If we were not, there has been times throughout history where food has not been available in great quantities, or the regular food that we eat has not been available in great quantities. Equally, and I'll bring Steve back in when we talk about blue zones, we can go around the world and see just how diverse food can be. Now, we have the great advantage in the year 2025, as we record this show, that we can go to the supermarket now, Steve, and there's literally food in the fruit and veg section alone, never mind the rest of it, which has come halfway across the planet on a container ship. So we can now have access to food from literally thousands of miles away. But in reality, as Steve and I have discussed on multiple shows, the idea of primitive man only being able to eat a certain particular way means humanity would have died out. We recognize colors, etc., in nature, some as being toxic and poisonous. At least one of the tribal members has died. Don't eat that. and so on and so forth. We learned with fire that we could cook food, etc., etc. But I mean, to give you an example, and I've actually done this a couple of times. Okay, the modern culture has led towards, on more than one occasion, and it's a little bit annoying when I hear people saying this kind of stuff. Oh, I don't eat vegetables. What are you, a child? Eat your fucking goddamn vegetables because of the macronutrients that Steve's already mentioned, the benefits, the fruit and vegetables. People literally will only have processed food, and then they will be on medications because they're only eating processed food. An obvious example, I've done this a couple of times recently, including with a client, where photographs, which are great, on our logs, on our forum, which we think are absolutely amazing, but people will post up the occasional photograph, Steve, and there's almost no colour to it. There's brown steak cooked well, as they like. There's a good carbohydrate source like rice, like we just talked about, perhaps pasta. But there's no colour on the plate. There's no fruit. There's no vegetables. There's no onions. There's no peppers. There's no mushrooms. There's no colour. And arguably, Steve, some of the colours that should be on that plate, reds, the greens, the yellows, etc., are where the macronutrients for vitamins and minerals are coming from. They're alternative carbs. Where's the fibre? And so on and so forth. So, look, I've been involved for 7.5 years in the food industry. And at the end of my career at that particular time, because I was just doing the normal work you'd expect of a factory, towards the last 6 or 9 months, I worked with product development team as well as my normal day job. And I'm incredibly aware from that, plus my time with the supplement industry, that how food is in effect designed, and that includes the appearance. From the wonderful photographs presented on the box to it doesn't quite look like that when you take it out, to how it's supposed to be part cooked looking so that you get the color of a crust, which is still not been put in the oven yet, and so on and so forth, and how food is literally made to look that way and preserved to look that way. And that's the stuff that you're buying from the freezers and the pre-prepared meal sections of the supermarket. And even the low grade, just for the company to make a profit, of the meat, for example, in those foods, and that includes the carbohydrates. How many times have I said to refer to, which is a carbohydrate, horrendous glucose syrup added as a sweetener to make the low-grade food taste nicer, i.e. sweeter on your palate, versus the quality. And we have better, I think, in this country, Steve, in some ways, in terms of how food is broken down on the label, but there's no indication of the food quality. How does this product compare to something that you cooked from the raw materials, the potatoes, the meat, the gravy, etc., that made up, for example, say a meat and potato pie, versus the way it's been prepared and made according to a price for economic reasons, for business reasons, in a factory before it was put into the box and then traveled in a frozen container on a lorry to be delivered to the shop and might be there for a very long time. And then in the freezer in your house, it has to taste fresh when it comes out. So there is no argument, I think, Steve, in the idea that you prepare these things for yourself, specific to your requirements, which is what we're just a little bit, because obviously we can't talk about individuals on this show, we can generalize, versus the stuff that you buy that's pre-prepared, either in a restaurant, fast food joint, takeaway, in the supermarket, wherever you buy your food. If it's pre-prepared, if it's processed, it will never, never match the quality. And it can still have great ingredients in it. And there's some premium products out there, Steve, but it still won't be as good as if you made it yourself. Back to you.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about different steroids and the way professional athletes, not just in bodybuilding, but how they carb cycle and stuff. But first, let's talk more, as Mobster brought up. The purpose of this podcast is not to persuade you to do a high carb diet or low carb diet or high protein or low protein. We're just giving you the facts. At the end of the day, you've got to experiment with this stuff and see what works best for you.
Yeah,
You
for
know,
you, yes,
yeah,
yes.
and I don't follow necessarily. I follow primarily a balanced diet myself. I don't go high carb, but if I'm using certain steroids In the past, I would go more high carb. So again, let me just factor that. Let me give you some facts here. If we take a look at the people around the world who are living the longest and living the healthiest, these aren't bodybuilders, okay? But they look pretty damn good. I've seen some pictures of these people who live in, as the officer said, the blue zones, and you can look this up yourself. You got guys who are 80, 85, 90 years old who are working outside. They're fixing their roof. There's a story about a guy I read in an article. He put up an entire fence going around his house. He's 92 years old, living in a blue zone. He follows a blue zone diet, does the blue zone, all the blue zone thing, the fasting, and all this other stuff. And he one morning woke up in the morning and was like, I want to build a fence. So he went to the store. He bought all the fencing materials on his own. He built an entire fence going around his house, which would have taken a crew, maybe like 3-4 hours to do. He did it all in about 8 or 9 hours on his own. Okay, with a hammer and nails and everything. He built the entire thing. So he's an absolute maniac. And this guy, so these are these people who live over 100 years old, the centurions who live healthy. They don't know what cancer is. They don't know what obesity is. They don't know what heart disease is. They don't know what liver disease is. They don't have any of these problems. 2/3 of their diets, of the macros, are going to be carbs. 2/3. But they're clean carbs. They're the clean carbs I mentioned above. They're not the dirty carbs. Okay, they're not sitting around eating cake and cookies and ice cream. They're eating healthy carbs in their diets. And each blue zone does it a little different. Some blue zones are more potato heavy, like in Okinawa, 50% of their diet is sweet potatoes. Some are more fruit heavy, like in Nicoya, Costa Rica. It's fruit heavy. They have tropical fruits. My goodness, there's tropical fruits all over the place. They can just go and pick a piece of fruit off a tree in their backyard because they can grow them. And in other places, like in Greece or Italy, it's more beans and peas and types of legumes. So it just depends on what part of the blue zone we're talking about. So they have different carbs that they eat, but 2/3 are going to be carbs. So their fats are typically 20% or less, and their protein is 10 to 15% or less. So this proves that, look, carbs are not your enemy, but bad carbs are. So learn the difference, guys, between good carbs and bad carbs. Same thing with proteins. Learn the difference between good proteins and bad proteins. Bacon, sausage, these are bad proteins. And they're bad fats as well, if we're going to go down that route. But a good quality, hormone-free chicken or a grass-fed piece of beef, those are good proteins. So we gotta separate the good and bad. Same thing with fats. There are bad fats, there are good fats. Okay? You go to a fast food joint, they smother their food in bad fats, and then you eat that shit. But if you get good fats, like from raw nuts, from whole eggs, these are good fat examples. So there's a difference. Now let's talk about carbs. What happens when you eat a carb?
Mm.
So I'm going to explain it really, really simple. You eat a carb, your body breaks it down into simple sugars, like
Yeah.
glucose for the most part, by enzymes in your body. Then the glucose is absorbed into your bloodstream. So you may want to consider, as I said in the earlier segment, if you're gonna go more on the legume, the peas, the beans, those types, the
Yes.
lentils. I know for me, I love me some lentil soup, but if I eat lentil soup, it doesn't end well for me. I'm on
Yeah,
the
you're gonna
toilet.
fight. You're gonna
Same thing with
fart. Yeah,
beans.
yeah,
Same thing
yeah,
with beans. Same thing with peas. So if I'm going to eat that stuff, I got to take enzymes. So that's why, because your body's unable to break it down. So you're doing your body no favors when it's not able to break it down in the first place. But so that's something to keep in mind. But what happens is your body will break it down. It gets absorbed into your bloodstream. Now, glucose is our primary source of energy, and it's used by cells to produce energy through cellular respiration.
yeah.
If you have excess glucose, then that gets stored for later use in our liver and muscles as glycogen, which is what we burn through when we train, whether it be cardio, weights, anything.
Yeah.
When you eat protein, this is the thing people don't understand. This is the thing what bodybuilders understand. This is what gets them in trouble when it comes to their low carb, no carb diets. When you eat protein, guess what? It also gets converted into glucose via glucogenesis. And that takes place in the liver. So when there's no carbs available, this process will happen. This is the primary model behind the whole keto diet, which has really been bastardized by these gurus online and not even accurate. And their idea of keto diet is going to Chipotle. I mean, that's their idea of keto diet. I mean, it's so silly. But if you look at this and you understand the way the body works, whether you have a steak or you have a potato, it's going to get converted one way or the other into glucose. So to make the argument, well, I can't have carbs because oh my god, carbs will give me glucose. I've so many people over the years have told me, oh, I'm staying away from carbs. I'm staying away from carbs. It's like, why? It don't matter. You're staying away from carbs, but then you're going eating something out of a package. It doesn't make any sense. So you don't have to be scared of carbs, is what I'm trying to explain. And we've been so brainwashed into thinking that carbs are our enemy that this is the type of stuff that happens. And the bottom line is the reason for that is all these good carbs that we talk about, there's no profit in recommending them to
Hmm.
people. That you can't, saying you there's no profit in it because these people who grow these products, you go over the list, the potatoes, the oatmeal, the rice, the fruit, the vegetables, the raw honey, the lentils, they don't have billions of dollars to
No.
market their products to you. They're barely making any margins at all. But the
Yeah.
food companies that put stuff in packages, they're the ones that want to market their stuff. They're the ones that have
Here's
the
a thought as well,
margins.
Steve. I'll tell you what happens, and this is very brief. Social media video giving you this kind of information, a little snippet, which I'm sure some of the listeners know, but I'll repeat it anyway. In order for you to get attention, you need clickbait. In order for you to get traction, you need clickbait. You need sexy titles, and you need sometimes to stand out from the background. And sometimes the only way that you become a guru or stand out from the background is to somehow differ with your version of the information that you're providing. Now, the reality is, and if those people are anything like an expert, they will know this, is that they know what basically works. They know what the best approach for most people is. But in order for you to pay attention to them, for them to catch their eye by jumping up and down and metaphorically waving in the air to get you to come over and listen to them, they have to say something different. So they'll talk about arcing the percentages. They'll say, oh, you shouldn't be doing this percentage of this, or you shouldn't be doing that percentage of that, or you should only be doing this in the morning. You shouldn't be doing that in the morning, and so on and so forth. And that gets you their attention. You get to go over and listen to them. And then you get on to watch their videos, make their money through social media and so on and so forth. And again, I guarantee, Steve, that 9 times out of 10, once they've got your attention, and especially if they take you on as a client or whatever else, they will not be reinventing the nutritional wheel when it comes to the information. They've got you, you've hooked, you've paid, now they're getting down and dirty. And the down and dirty tends to be around the basics. It will be any differences will be fractional. It is very easy to say it's 31% this and 29% of that. It literally comes down to the individual in that particular regards, but the basics is the same. State registered nutritionists in America, UK, national registered nutritionists here in this country all have a really, really, really good framework from which they operate. And I guarantee, Steve, there would be very little difference, historically speaking, between one expert's knowledge and the next expert's knowledge. But for you to pay attention to a particular expert requires them to stand out and be different. Let me tell a story that I was talking about earlier on with Steve in the pre-show, and I'll bring Steve back in just to make sure that we cover certain points. So in the show pre-show, I said to Steve, the story was we have, and I've mentioned this before, we have a local former IFBB pro bodybuilder who from time to time, is not something he did needed to do then and doesn't need to do now, but occasionally would put together prep. That would be food and specifically steroids, obviously, prep for someone getting ready for a show. And in particular circumstances were thus. A male and female, husband and wife clients came to him as a pair, and he'd done a deal for them as a pair. And the fella, I think, had zero issues with the food, the steroid cycle, etc., etc. No real great questions. But I believe because they'd done it jointly, Steve, I think it was a 16-week prep. And I'm going to say off the top of my head, it was somewhere between 700 and £1,000. And literally, the bodybuilder's doing is just writing out his plan. This is where you're at week 1. This is where you need to be at week 16 for the both of them. It's a bit of work, £1,000. Fine. She wasn't happy because the person she'd worked with previously had allowed her, by some miraculous medical condition that even today would baffle medical science, she was allowed to have donuts. And the bodybuilder said, number one, if that's what was working for you before, why did you go away from that client? The coach, sorry, come to me. Number two, what the fuck kind of prep for any kind of competition has you having donuts in the middle of the prep? Why can't you have good carbs like Steve talked about, fibrous carbs and fruit and so on and so forth? What medical condition that would baffle any medical doctor allows you to have donuts as this great carb source for you? It's ridiculous. But I mean, the main thing came down to literally what happened was she ended up being quite public, kicking off and demanding her money back. And he's pointing out how awful she was as a client. But the whole donut thing was almost a joke, Steve. The very idea that you can somehow choose to eat and act in that particular way and get upset because you're not allowed to have donuts when you're supposed to be getting ready for a competition was just quite ridiculous. So, yeah, I mean, look, guys, we can go back and forth over particular food choices, absolutely. And we can talk about the sensitivity and so on and so forth. Let's address those particular points kind of now, Steve. Just to be clear, modern food is not as good as the older stuff. The more basic and food prepped your food is, the better it is, the more organic. Even silly things like how close to where you live is better and so on and so forth. And I think here's the thing, guys, and I think perhaps the donut story applies to this. People want to be able to eat what they like to eat versus what they need to eat in order to perform at their best. And I think specifically now, Steve, in terms of athletes and carb cycling, etc., which we're going to cover short.
Yeah, and let's go over professional athletes and carb cycling and kind of explain what that is before we start getting into the cycles as we're coming up on time here. So let me kind of explain this a little bit, and then Mobster, you can kind of chime in on this before we have to move on to cycling. Look, professional athletes of all sports, they cycle carbs. This is old news. This is something that they've realized. It works for them. It makes sense. I'm going to explain it. So you got high carb days, you got low carb days. So on high carb days, they'll go with 200 to 300 grams of carbs per day. Sometimes higher. It just depends on their sport. On low carb days, they'll go lower, 50 to 100 grams per day. So it depends how much training that person is doing day by day. So they're not like a robot where they're eating every single day the same amount of carbs, day in and day out, which is something that I always recommend, whether it be carbs, proteins, fats, calories. I always recommend you cycle. In most situations, you cycle them up and down day by day. Some days you're even going to get zero because some days, if you're going to fast, for example, I do a lot of fasting, and a lot of guys on the forum are doing fasting. So on days you're fasting, and a lot of athletes are doing fasting. So obviously you're going to get zero that day. So there's no rule where you have to hit a certain macro every day. And professional athletes have learned this over the years. It's good for your body to cycle it up and down instead of keeping it consistent. So, give you an example. If you're traveling for a road game and you're on a plane all day, let's say you have to travel to London or Germany, okay? You're an NFL player. You travel to London, Germany. You're on the plane all fucking day, okay? You have to do a stopover and everything. You're not exercising. You're not burning calories sitting your ass in the plane, right? Like a sardine. So on that particular day, you're going to go low carb. But if it's a day where you're in training camp, you're out there in the hot sun, you're in your pads, you're sweating bullets, you're burning a shit ton of calories running around, even just standing there on the sideline, you're burning a shit ton of calories because your body heat's elevated, your metabolism's elevated, you're burning like crazy. Then those are the days, or if you have a game where you're playing a lot of minutes, or a hockey player, can you imagine the hockey players? They got to go high carb on those days. They got to make back those carbs that they're losing. So that's what they do. So they'll cycle their carbs up and down. So that'd be the example that you guys can try who want to experiment with some of these more high carb options on cycle. You
Yeah,
can kind of on your workout days, I'll use it. You can give the example too, Mobster, but I'll give you an example
yeah,
of what I used to do when I was in a deep cycle. On workout days, I would make sure that day I'm getting more carbs in that day. If I was hammering the gym for like an hour, like on a leg day, for example, the leg days you're probably going to burn more carbs and more calories on leg day more than anything. So leg day plus cardio, 10, 15 minutes on the stair climber, 30 minutes on the treadmill, whatever. Those are the days you burn a shit. You'll notice that you burn a shit ton of carbs. And I'm going to explain in the next segment, especially if you're on cycle, why you need to get your carbs back. But on days where I'm sitting on my ass on a Sunday watching the football all day,
yeah.
I'm not going to get as much carbs. You see? So I learned that when I was in my 30s, late 20s, and 30s, and it really worked for me. So touch on that, Mobster. Give us an example, and then we got to
Yeah.
go on to the best cycles.
Right. So a couple of examples here, guys. One specifically addresses the amount of calories that most people, and I mentioned this to Steve in the pre-show, the typical bodybuilding workout by an average Joe burns roughly, I don't think statistically it's changed that much, Steve. Body weights might have got slightly higher, but roughly 400 calories. You're going to the gym, you're lifting weights for an hour, maybe you do a gentle circuit, you're looking to get in moderate shape, 400 calories. Obviously, hotter days is slightly more. If you're doing more cardio, if you're literally crazy running around the gym doing circuits, etc., might be slightly higher. I know, for example, and I said this to Steve again in the pre-show, that my daily steps are somewhere between 800 and 1,000 calories. If I hit 6 to 8,000 steps a day, between 800 and 1,000 calories burned, just walking up and down, doing the nature trail stuff that I do. One of the things I said, and it's to do with the lifestyle versus diet, but we are talking about diets here, so let's be specific. Low carb, for example, I've said if you're prepping for a show, and especially as you're coming in towards a show the last few weeks, when you're going to be manipulating the variables, your PEDs as well as the carbohydrates, your fat, your protein, etc., enormously to produce that peak physique. One of the things I said, if you're low carbs, most of my carbs for that day, if I was in your shoes, would be around the time of the workout. You can, of course, train fasted. That's another option, and so on and so forth. But we're talking about manipulating the variables and producing a certain particular look on the day, on stage, around that sort of stuff. As an example, again, and Steve's already addressed this, the idea that somehow weightlifting, weight training, even strongman, is calorific and or specifically requires more carbohydrates than, say, for example, certain other athletes is almost a joke. Steve has at times competed in and certainly taken part in multiple triathlons over the length of his athletic career, up to and including today, certainly a few years ago. And the idea that, for example, if I go to the gym and lift epic weights, I would need more carbs than Steve is just a joke compared to, say, on his triathlon, swimming, running, and riding a bicycle. I think there's one more thing here, Steve, and I just use myself as an example again. I have multiple cereal-based options that I have for breakfast in the morning. That's what I do. But my best performance, and I do this specifically for those particular days, I think I even sometimes manipulate it a little bit on arm days, but I did this recently for my out-and-out max squat last Monday, Steve. I made sure that my food that went in the night before, included carbohydrates, was clean as possible and certainly as healthy as possible. And the morning of the day that I'm going to the gym to try and max out my squat, that was 100% oatmeal. I was not going to have any other choice there. So, look, I think, let me finish on this particular thought segment, Steve. We move on to steroid cycles and high carbs and so on. You will notice, this is a lesson, really. You will notice if Steve and I did 1 month of any crap we liked and poor carb sources, and then did another 4 weeks, another month of the best carbohydrate sources we possibly could, I guarantee you that our sense of well-being, the quality of the skin, the brightness of her eyes, the cleanliness of her hair, but specifically the kind of energy levels we have without even fasting, which is another thing that Steve could get into for another time. We would notice a difference. And this is why we encourage you as much as possible to have the best sources and almost do that as an experiment for yourself, just to see the difference between the good sources and the bad sources, and how you might, for example, do 1 week of X number and then another week slightly lower and then another week slightly higher. And I guarantee again, over those weeks, at the end of the month, if you were to go back and give yourself some sort of scoring system on a week by week basis that you've manipulated the variables, and you give it on a 1 to 10 basis, I guarantee you, Steve, that if the sources were good, you could see what numbers you were doing on certain particular days and say, my energy level on this day was great. My energy level on this day was poor. How I felt on those carbs was good. How I felt on those carbs was bad. And I guarantee you there would be a number that's specific to you with good carbs, good sources, and the right ratios. But I think the variable which we're going to discuss now, which is super important for these kind of shows, is the difference that perhaps using steroids can make, and specifically certain kinds of steroids.
So let's get into that because we're coming up on the time here. So let's start by, let me explain a little bit. It's very important to understand that different steroids require different carb requirements. If you want to run the cycle, take advantage of the cycle, but also have a smooth cycle with lower side effects. The reason is that certain steroids at certain dosing especially will require higher carbs. They're fierce nutrient partitioners. That's how they work so well. They also rapidly will increase muscle insulin resistance. And when that happens is you start getting those hypo sensations. Those of you who are listening to this right now, you're probably nodding your head right now and be like, yeah, I went through this. I was running so-and-so steroid cycle and I started getting hypo feelings. I wake up in the middle of the night in a pool of sweat. I wake up in the middle of the night shaky. I didn't understand what was going on with me. I felt hypo, you know? Well, think about it. That day, I bet you didn't get enough carbs. That day, I bet you didn't spread your carbs out enough. Okay? And that's going to lead to that. So you have to adjust your diet when you're using some of these steroids. Now, the first one is the big one. It's trenbolone. And I used trenbolone quite heavily in my 30s. It helped me achieve certain feats that would have never been possible without tren. Okay? But the thing is about trenbolone, it is a potent nutrient partitioner, absolutely potent. Think about it like a sponge. It's just sucking out everything that you eat right into the muscle, all right? And you'll see incredible results on tren. It's something that you should run. If you're serious about using steroids, you're serious about bodybuilding, tren is one you eventually are going to want to try out for yourself. And it's one of those that you're going to love and you're going to hate. Because what happens is if you don't get enough carbs and you don't spread your carbs out throughout the day, I remember I did a move one time. And, you know, when you're moving, you're not thinking about eating. You're not thinking about, you know, getting in enough carbs. You're just trying to get the move done to get it done in one day so life can get back to normal, right? Because moving sucks. So I can remember one day I did a move and I didn't get enough food that day. I wasn't eating enough carbs and I was deep into a tren cycle, right? That night, I woke up in the middle of the night in a pool of sweat. I had the shakes. I was freaking out. I was like, what the fuck is wrong with me? So then I thought to myself, oh my God, this is happening. I didn't get enough carbs today. I started realizing what was happening. So what I would do is I would prepare these pancakes. I'd cook these pancakes with good quality ingredients, high carb pancakes, and I would freeze them. So I make a bunch of them in the pan, right? I food prep them and I put them in the freezer. Whenever I needed them, and in case of emergency, I'll do them. So I took the fucking pancakes out. I took like 3 pancakes out. I put them in the microwave and I heated them up. And it was the longest fucking 45 seconds of my life, Mobster, waiting for them to heat up. And then I took them and I drenched them in raw honey. Okay, raw fucking honey, local honey. Then I took them to the shower because I was fucking sweating my balls off. And I started eating them in the shower and I took a cold shower, cooled my whole body down.
Oh my God.
And like 5 minutes
That's
later.
That's a picture right there for the album.
So 5 minutes later, I felt so much better. But what happened in that situation is what I talked about earlier. My body just ran out of anything to burn because the trend burns everything in your body and leaves you with nothing. There's no glycogen left. So that was why my body, I was basically having hypo symptoms. Now, would I have died in that situation? No, but it was extremely uncomfortable. And these are a lot of the side effects people report on trend. So it's very important on trend to have a strategy like that.
Yeah,
My strategy was the frozen pancakes I'd prep. I also have raw juice. I'd keep raw juice, the best quality juice you can, and I drink that before bed, and that would help. I've seen guys over the years actually copy that strategy, and it's worked for them while they're on trend.
yeah,
They'll drink like a cup of raw juice before bed, and that would get them through the night. Otherwise, and a lot of you out there who are really really big, especially these big bodybuilders, mobster who are like 300 pounds using
yeah.
trend and using all these steroids and using HGH, they have to get up in the middle of the night and have some quick carbs just
Mm.
to prevent those side effects so they can actually get a night's sleep without having to wake up the way I was in a freaking panic. Talk about that a little bit and we'll move on to the next
Yeah,
topic.
I mean, just as a story for myself, Steve, I've happened a couple of times, and we actually, when we go trail walking, there's nearly always some sort of a glucose-based drink in the Jeep for that particular reason. But a couple of times, we was able to go out straight from the gym. My girlfriend would pick me up straight from the gym, and straight out. It's a lovely sunny day. Let's go. And we find a mountain, and we start, hill climbing and trail walking and whatever else. 15 or 20 minutes in, I'd burnt up all the available glycogen, so it felt glucose in my body at that particular point. And like Steve said, I wouldn't have died and collapsed. I wasn't using Tren, but there are other PDs, and we'll touch on those momentarily, where the glucose needed to come out. I sit down for 5 or 10 minutes. I'm hydrated. I've got a little bit of energy back in. I'm fine. If I go home and sit down after the gym, Steve, I'm fine. And I can have my protein drink and then, wait for an hour or two and then have lunch. But this is straight out burning energy that I essentially already burnt up, and I was kind of
So
fucked.
so my
So
spouse, yeah.
what other
Well,
PEDs,
let me
Steve?
just say this. My
Yeah,
spouse at the time when I was really abusing trends, she was a military. She was in the military. So she would wake me up early. Let's go exercise. Let's go do this, Steve. Let's go hiking. Let's go jogging. So what I would have to do is, as Mobster said, I'd actually have to go to the pharmacy and buy those glucose tabs that diabetics have to
yes, yes,
carry
yes,
around in
yes.
case they overdose on insulin. So I'd have to carry those around. So if you're doing long hikes or something like that, where you're not going to have access to food, you're not going to have access to that freezer and be able to put the pancakes in the microwave.
Let me
You could
talk about
take,
the military thing that you've just
yeah,
mentioned,
you could
Steve. I've
take
actually,
some
yeah,
bars with you as well. Get some good
yes,
quality
just in
bars,
case. Yeah,
and you can carry those with you because if you're using Tren, it's not gonna
yeah.
work. But talk just that really quick, and we'll move on to the
Very,
next.
very quickly then. So I've had a couple of conversations with a local fellow called Cole Gilson. Cole is a former Royal Marines Commando physical training instructor. And locally, we have something that's called the fan dance, which is by the special forces, similar to the Green Berets, etc., that you've got in the States with the SES in this country. And one of the things that the commandos and Marines and the SAS do is this 15-mile up and down the mountain twice and over another mountain nearby, etc. And it all has to be done in a certain period of time. They also send them out individually in the middle of the night to go yomping across this stuff which is called moongrass, and it's horrendous. And one of the things that the military have done, I suspect Steve's former girlfriend will probably be applicable in this regard, is that they've looked at the variables when it comes to food and energy, because not only are you got to walk 15 miles in the bloody dark up fucking mountain, Steve, possibly carrying a bag full of God knows what kit, etc., and arguably a gun and so on and so forth. You also have to perform by be able to shoot the enemy or do certain particular things when you get to where you're going at a high level. So they've absolutely looked at hydration and glucose and the food that they give them before they go out on these things and the food they can carry and the quality of the food that they can carry way more than the military forces in both countries worldwide and arguably have done in the past. The crap that they used to eat before versus the stuff they have now. And again, you're talking about high-tech machinery, the accuracy of being able to shoot properly and defend yourself after you've walked several times up and down a mountain, in the rain, in the dark, in the heat, in whatever,
Yeah.
in the snow, in the desert, and so on and so forth. So it's super, super, super important.
Especially if you're
And
on
that,
steroids, that's the issue,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. So let's talk about other
Yeah.
steroids that you think, Steve, might also cause
So
issues for
there's
the listeners.
four orals that I kind of came up with that I've had experience with that also you're gonna need to spread your carbs out. Anadrol, Dianabol, Superdrol, and Halo, especially at higher dosing. You know, and each of these, you know, you can make your own determination on what would can be considered a higher dose. But
Yeah,
if you don't get in enough carbs on these, they're very good at nutrient partitioning. They have androgenic properties, so that can also require carb options. Testosterone is another one, but it's got to be at higher doses. Like, so if you're running a TR2 dose of testosterone, you should
yeah.
never need
No,
excess carbs. But if you're running testosterone 500 over 500 milligrams, 750, 1,000 or more, it's absolutely going to increase your insulin resistance. We see this trend with people who are put on TRT for long term at an excess amount of TRT, like sports TRT,
yes,
200,
yes, yes,
250,
yes,
300. Maybe at first it won't be an issue, but over time their insulin
yes.
resistance keeps on getting boosted. So eventually they're going to have those issues when it comes to these side effects. So it's not good at all. This is why I'm not a proponent of going to these clinics.
I would argue, Steve, that the higher dosages for Debo and Anavar would arguably be the 100 milligrams, which I do see some competitive bodybuilders using for short periods of time, 4 weeks or less, sometimes the last 2 weeks of competition in the case of Anavar. For the most users, we know that typically you'd be looking at 30 to 50 milligrams on the Dynabol and 50 milligrams on Anavar. But okay, competing bodybuilders do things differently for short periods of time. So you need to be aware of the effect it might have on your body in this regard. And again, work with your
And
coach in that
and the
regard. So,
Euro-Pharma products are dosed properly. So they're not like the steroids you're going to get from your buddy at the gym. So you got to keep that in mind
yeah,
too.
yeah,
So
yeah.
300 milligrams of Tren, of Euro-Pharma Tren, is probably going to be equal to 600 or 700 milligrams from your buddy.
Yes,
So you don't, so a
yes,
little bit goes a long way because they're dosed properly. So on Tren, once you start getting 400, 500, 600 milligrams on Tren, if you're going to use Euro-Pharmacy's Tren, you're going to expect these side effects to hit you like a thunderbolt if you're not getting
yeah,
these carb options. But when I was using Tren, even at 250 or 300, the longer you stay on Tren, the more it builds up and builds up and builds up. The last one, too, is the Euro-Pharma HGH. And again, this goes back to what I just said about the difference between this HGH and the HGH that you would get from a buddy at the gym. This HGH is dosed very potent, very, very well dosed properly. And what happens with HGH, if you're running HGH at an excessive dose, which is anything above 2 or 3 IUs a day, you're going to build insulin resistance over time. So we see a lot of bodybuilders, they'll use a lot of HGH, but they'll also throw in insulin on top of it for that reason to bring down their blood sugar levels. So you've got to be aware if you're going to abuse HGH, you absolutely will need to start increasing your carbs as you go. So that's basically something to watch out for. So if unless you're competing, really no reason with HGH ever to exceed, especially using Euro-Pharma HGH, really to exceed 2 IUs. And look, Mobster and I could sit here and tell you run a ton of gear, run a ton of gear, and let's sell some Euro-Pharma products to you guys. But look, that's not what we're doing here. We want you to use these compounds properly. But if you do want to push yourself and use them at an excessive level, you're going to have to adjust your carbs or you're going to be in a world of hurt on cycle where you're going to be waking up in the middle of the night. It's going to affect your sleep and it's going to end up being counterproductive. So that's really the point of this podcast that we wanted to address. So, Monster, we have a couple minutes left.
yes.
You're the biggest Europharma
I
fan
am,
out
Steve.
there.
I
So why
am.
don't you
Right.
spend the next 2 minutes explaining why
Yeah.
you love Europharma before we do the
One
disclaimer?
of the phrases I've used, listeners, is the one-stop shop approach. I mean, supermarkets try to do this, Steve. They really want you to come to their shop and their shop only, and they will serve you, pretty much sell you anything. There's a shop Trago near us, Steve, that has had cars and motorbikes inside the shop. And it's not as good as a supermarket, but you can buy a kitchen, you can buy a front room, whatever, carpets, as well as dog food and biscuits and all manner of things. It's enormous. It's way bigger than a local supermarket, and they're pretty goddamn big. For me, Euro-Pharmacies has everything. I'm just looking on the products tab on the europharmacies.net website. They have fat loss products, Steve, human growth hormone, injectable 10 mil, injectable 15 mil, oral bags for those of you that prefer it, oral blisters, peptides, and SARMs. I really think, I mean, it doesn't even talk about it properly because the oral bags and oral blisters include the breakdown for ancillaries as well as obviously steroids. Peptides includes growth hormone. SARMs, peptides will, of course, all the new derivative peptides that are being used within performance enhancement, and SARMs as well, of course, especially popular for the last few weeks. There are lab results on this page. There's information on who Euro-Pharmacies are and how long they've been in the industry doing exactly what they're doing. There's a distributors check tab. Look, guys, when I say one stop, I mean one stop. There are very few companies properly, because it's one way you can do, Steve, is you specialize. The other way is to generalize, and you have literally 47 different companies working with you, and that's what resellers do. In order for Euro-Pharmacies to stand out in the market, and for the reason why I like them, Steve, is I use the phrase, and it's in my signature line on the forums, tried, tested, trusted. Like Steve said, we are well aware of how companies used to produce great products, but then the standard would drop off. We're well aware of the products that people can buy cheap with no labels on because my buddy said this stuff is good, like Steve said right there. We know how people used to buy stuff out of the bag of the local dealer. People still talk about my source like that, Steve. And I even turn around and say, I think you mean your local steroid dealer. Why don't you say your steroid dealer? It's not a source. So is it your mates? Is it a buddy? No. You want to be able to go to a company that provides good, solid, tried, tested, trusted products with samples that you can look at. Products quality. You want to be able to know the name of the reseller. Is it a distributor that's trusted by Euro-Pharmacies? Have they given this company approval to distribute their brand? We talk about lab results constantly, Steve, and I want to be able to see that. Some companies have lab results, but they're years old. I want to see regular, up-to-date lab results. If I've got a problem, I can ask. I've even done this, I think, one time before, Steve, where the lab result was a little bit old, and I asked for an up-to-date lab result, and I got an up-to-date lab result. Reps for Euro-Pharmacies, and specifically for one of the distributors, have come onto the forum and will post up-to-date lab results that have been done. We know, because Euro-Pharmacies is one of our approved sources, where members of the forum have specifically tested those products. That's the stuff we like. And the last thing, Steve, and we talk about this quite often when we refer to logs on the forum, the simple fact of the matter is, if you've never used this company before, you can go to multiple forums, but specifically the Evolutionary.org family of forums, and put in Euro-Pharmacies and see if a log, someone who's running a training log, using PDs, dieting to get into shape, is running Euro-Pharmacies products, and you can look at what they're doing. You can DM them and ask. You can literally say, Joe's doing their product, Joe's getting into great shape. What dosages was Joe doing? Is it all Euro-Pharmacies product, and so on and so forth? I myself have run a few logs just exactly like that for you guys to be able to search. And that's the sort of stuff, that's the reason why we like Euro-Pharmacies. It's why they're popular. It's why they're tried, tested, and trusted, Steve. Please note, we are not doctors and the opinion's ours. It is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment apply.